So good morning, good day, good evening to everyone everywhere who is here now with us. And we appreciate your ears and your listening and the chance to communicate what we have learned and think we've learned anyhow, and do it openly and publicly, and share this information and share the concepts of both sobriety and also the concept of mental addiction being the core issue of addiction, and that it being something humans suffer from. It isn't narrowed to just the few people who have overt, obvious compulsions, but anyone who has reactive and impulsive behaviors that lead to compulsions. All of those things are indications of a defensive nature, and the primary thing that we do as humans is think before we act, which is always the case. And to the degree that we're defensive, we're going to react in ways that are not response-able, given that they are automatic, knee-jerk defensive postures. So we're talking about it here openly. Mental health is a problem, in my estimation, that is compounded by the idea that we can't talk about it openly in public, and that the stigma is that, we can have a cold and talk about being sick, but when we're struggling and having inner conflict and thoughts, we tend to bemoan the problem, often telling stories about why it's happening rather than discuss our direct relationship to the cause of that problem. And I would say that's the foreign language that has not been read very well, thinking it's foreign when in fact it's a domestic language our body speaks in the body language we're given, and we misinterpret it to excuse and use stories to justify we don't have anything to do with it. So we're here to talk about it. And Austin is here with me, who is a friend and son of one of the guys I've known when I came to Venice early 40 years ago, who was very active in the neighborhood and is sober a long time. And Austin and I met about 5 years ago and have worked together pretty consistently through that time. And so I thought he would be an interesting voice to hear, as he always is whenever I hear his voice. So good morning, Austin.
Good morning. I believe 5 years ago wasn't the first time we ever met. I mean, I think you said you knew when I was born.
Yeah. I don't remember you noticing my awareness of you, but I was definitely around when you were first born as a child.
Yeah, I don't think I noticed anyone's awareness until maybe 2 years ago.
Well, we probably know, we just don't think we know, because it's sort of an awareness that's so subtle and so seemingly out of reach to the things that we tend to occupy ourselves with.
I wouldn't even say probably. It's like a definite. We do know, and
Yeah.
all of our lives I've spent fighting that fact.
Well, and part of the point of this conversation is not to make claims that are so hard and fast that there can't be exceptions to them, because that tends to have people who are listening think immediately it's not worth listening to because there's some conflict with what they're thinking. And so I always want to temper everything with the possibility that there's more we could talk about, and probably more accurate ways we could talk about it. And yet at the same time, if we're talking about truth is true, it's hard not to agree with that unless the ideas I have about truth aren't true. And then it would be easy to say, well, truth isn't true when this, that, or the other thing happens, because I'm thinking about it in ways that aren't actually true. So those debates are certainly possible, but I would suggest, if there is anything absolute in our universe or beyond it, and I would suggest that if there's anything absolute, our universe is tiny. It only appears big given the life forms we're experiencing it from. If there is something absolute, it doesn't change when my thoughts about it change. And Shakespeare wrote about this in a sonnet, I think it's sonnet 116, where he said, love is an ever fixed mark. And when change it finds, he said, faltereth. When faltereth it finds, it does not falter. Maybe he used altereth. When altereth it finds, it does not alter. And he was talking about the fact that when things change, it doesn't change.
Yeah.
And ironically, maybe not ironically, one of the things in the universe that functions on that basis is light speed. And light speed is absolute. So that means however fast it's going, wherever you are in relation to it, no matter how fast you're going, it's still going full speed ahead. It isn't going part speed based on a relative observation from where you're looking at it. It's always going full speed.
It's a constant speed, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And light is what we observe on a daily basis, right? So is that what we're seeing is.
Well, light provides for our eyes. Without light, our eyes don't work.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's obviously something to light that signifies life. And, I would say it's always been referenced as the thing that is pure and whole, and real light in an absolute sense doesn't have shadows in it. It's just pure white light. So there is no divisiveness or divisiveness or separation, etc. But within the confines of a relative experience that we're having in this universe, light breaks down into colors. But it doesn't really break down because it's just the sum total of all those colors the whole time. And depending, like rainbows are a good expression of light, and prisms express light. They're basically offering the opportunity to see the colors that are generally not seen, but are always there and present. They're all the makeup of white light are all colors. And we talked about that on the second mental obsession discussion that we recorded recently, that we got into that a little bit, recognizing that emotions are tied to those colors. So if we think the only thing that blocks light in our universe is matter, mm-hmm. and if I think something really matters, I'm blocking some of the light that's passing through me. And the impact on that is an emotion that tends to create whatever that absence is. I feel that color. And there are physics experiments and astronomical experiments where they realized when they were dissecting the light from different stars, there are black lines dissecting that light. And for years, they didn't know what that was, and finally realized that every one of those black lines related to the elements in the stars. If it was carbon and hydrogen, where carbon and hydrogen lines up to the colors of the light, there would be a missing line there. So what was missing was, in fact, the substance of the light, interestingly. So the substance of it didn't become apparent, it became missing. So it was already passing the light on, it didn't need to repeat itself. So where it already existed, it was missing on the spectrum of light being observed.
That's another terrifying fact, is what we look into space is only a fraction of the known universe. What we see, even though it's millions of stars and stuff, but the dark matter, it's everything you see in space is only maybe 10% of what's actually out there. I don't know.
Probably even less. Even less, because
way less.
The amount of matter compared to space is a tiny, small fraction. And if what they're discovering is that nothing matters, which is an interesting concept because we've thought of space as being nothing, and they're all of a sudden realizing that the majority of everything is what we've considered to be nothing. And I would say that's a pretty good definition of our conversation.
I know.
What we have dismissed about our own knowing nature, our own present awareness, our own being, has been to preoccupy ourselves with thought that become obstructive seemingly to reality and truth, forcing on us a seeming reality and truth that's impossible to bear. And we're a pretty good species at expressing that kind of fractured state through corruption and pollution and the damage we do to other humans to try to prove that we're right. There would be no reason to kill people if what we were right about was right, rather than trying to make what's wrong right in a ideology or creed or convention or culture that was obviously not right. Somewhere in there, something's faulty to think the best we can do is kill people and or ourselves, because murder and homicide is just the difference in who you choose to kill. And addiction is suicide. It is never healthy. Compulsions are never healthy. Not one of them is a life for affirming act. They are all discounting, depreciating our capacity to function in a healthy, normal manner.
Well, everything about addiction is like a filling of an emptiness. What I, from my experience, at least personally, is always about this idea of I'm not enough. It's all about filling this empty space that I think is empty. And in relation to the conversation about space and that sort of dark matter, is we think that we can't see it, but it's there. And there's all this, like, the space even between you and me, if you were to shrink down to a tiny size, like, you would see particles and all this stuff. So we're trying to fill stuff into space that we think is empty, but it's there. And it's no wonder that when we do, it overflows with our bullshit and all sorts of craziness.
Well, but imagine that what we're seeing is we're seeing the thoughts we have that are empty.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're basing our experience right now, if I'm thinking about something that isn't happening, I'm thinking about something that has no substance. So it's all imagination. It's all my thoughts about what's happening that are happening. And if what I'm thinking about has no basis other than in my thought, it's just a self-serving concept I'm considering. And to think of that as true and real now pits me against reality and truth, or seems to when it can't. And so what's my experience? I'm empty. And what do I try to do? Fill it with more emptiness. All relative concepts have opposites. And here's how that works when it comes to the absolute. What's interesting about emptiness is that it's full of emptiness. So to add more emptiness to emptiness doesn't fill it. It just gives me the impression I need to keep going and going and going and going and going and going to get it full, because I think it's empty, rather than see that emptiness is a fullness on its own. On the other side, seeing it as empty in its actual state is saying, I don't need to do anything to fill it any further with emptiness. It's already empty. Now I'm free to start wondering and asking, am I interested in continuing to perpetuate empty ideas? Ideas that have no substance.
I wonder
because looking at it accurately, I now have perspective to see I can continue doing it and make believe it's all that I am and fight for it, or I can basically admit what it is and end up having the freedom, which I'm naturally aware of, to do whatever I want. And that certainly doesn't include having to redo that thing over and over and over again chronically to try to prove that it's true.
What do you think about, have you ever heard the philosophical term Proust's Madeleines? He was a French philosopher named Proust.
Proust
Madeleines.
I don't know. I know Proust, the French writer.
Okay, but maybe he's
remembrance
a writer,
of things past, and
that's what I'm. Yeah, so that's what I'm talking about. Is you know, he took a bite out of the Madeleine, the tea cookie, and it, you know, it brings up these long lost subconscious memories and
30 pages of them.
Yeah. So what do you think? Of course, I don't know, but of course, truth is true, and we can certainly put meaning into things that are not true, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's anything. But to us, there is, when we either, you know, take a bite of some home cooking, and you always talk about your dad's Caesar salad recipe. I'm sure every time you make that, it sends you through a simulation of emotion, and it almost feels real. But what do you just, what do you consider that? Just something like a ride, just not, it's not that deep and not that serious, and just something for you to enjoy? Or is there something really real to that? Because when we get taken back, and everything about addiction and is all about triggers, and, oh, I was triggered, so I acted this way. And that sort of, you know, being sent back to some memory, usually with triggers, it's a negative memory. So you act upon as if you're essentially time traveling, because something reminded you of something in the past, and then you act as if you were in that moment in the past. So while it's not true,
do you see in your description, you're thinking of it as real enough to not be where you are?
yeah, exactly. No, exactly.
Simply thinking about it.
But what do you know, how do you just chalk it up to an experience and nothing more? Or it, because in those moments, like, it really does feel real. It gives meaning to an experience.
Yes. But making meaning up to justify an experience is another thing we can do in thought. It doesn't make it any more real than what it is. And what it is an imagined thought based on a memory. And you defined, that you said the triggers attached to negative feelings. Well, that negative feeling is something we're obviously not having and thinking we shouldn't have, to make believe that our finger is on the trigger. And if anyone gets near it, we need to pull that trigger in a reactive, impulsive, compulsive behavior to protect ourselves from being found out for this thing we think we're hiding.
What is an experience without meaning, though? It's like
An experience.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, think of everything being what it is. It just is what it is. If you simplify it to that, it doesn't mean we can't make meaning out of it, and we can't turn it into purpose, and we can't turn it into something we want more than something else. It simply means that it is what it is. Now, what I do with it becomes what I do with it, rather than thinking it has something that now condemns me to it. I start actually acting responsibly in relation to it and see that the meaning it seems to have is meaning I give it, simply because I have preferences and I have desires, and I don't have to connect with that thing and be attached to that thing in an addictive manner to just notice that I'm having it the way I'm having it because I'm choosing to have it that way. That is a very different perspective than thinking of it as something that all of a sudden becomes imbued with a characteristic that I can't do anything about. So now I have to fight it to overcome that thing, when in fact, all I've made believe is that what it means to me, when I give something meaning, I'm making an investment in that thing. And my experience is that investments pay dividends based on risk. And if I've made an investment in something, the risk is I may not get what I want.
Right.
And so that expectation gets set up to think all that should happen is what I want. And now I'm in conflict with everyone and everything and everyone based on anything they do that doesn't provide that expectation and fulfill that thought. That's a big leap to take. It's certainly one we're capable of taking. It's certainly one we do often, but it isn't necessary. It's a choice. And to see it as necessary shows how quickly we get looped into this circular cycle of mentally obsessive thinking, trying to fix the thought with the thinking that broke it, and just keep thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it in new forms of stories to make believe somehow if we tell it right, it will become true, when in fact, the basis of a lie is that it always claims to be true. It's never a lie when it's not claiming to be true. When it's a lie, that's true. Doesn't mean we can't maintain ideas that are inaccurate, but when we think they're true, it all of a sudden turns into this thing that creates this inner conflict. And that, if truth and reality are truth and reality, and the absolute is absolute, it does not need our thinking to be, any more than fish need to understand water to swim. They're naturally designed to wag their tails and move through the water and get where they want to go. And they seem to do it pretty well without a lot of advanced theory and academic research. They just do it. They don't understand water at all. We, because we can think of ourselves, seem to think that we need to understand everything before we can conclude it. And what we're really looking to do is overcome the fear we have for the sensations we create by thinking we're separate and alone, and thinking because we can think of ourselves and impact ourselves in that way, that we are in fact then alone in a universe that does not care about us and is an impossible place to live and is harsh and everything other than what it actually is, simply to justify the thinking we're doing that's actually wrong and harsh and unjustifiable and irrational. We just don't understand our place to think in those terms.
You don't think, I feel like the universe is pretty harsh, but does that have to be a bad thing, though? That's the thing.
Well, have you ever heard the universe complain about itself?
No, but
we seem to have pretty clear ideas about something as big as the universe, and yet struggle to simply admit the source of those ideas. And just not notice that we are perfectly designed to register what's wrong. And to think that when I'm wrong, what I need to do is feel better about it is what the addiction, the trap of addiction, that's how it gets triggered.
But you don't think that, our anxieties are from this sort of subconscious anxiety or fear that we have, this, that we know that we without our tools and without all the things that we build up to survive in this world, we're just these flesh bags that are so vulnerable, and we on our own as like creatures in nature, we wouldn't survive because that's the miraculous thing about humans. Most animals, like, they don't have to think twice about their environments because their bodies are physically outfitted. Like bears, they can withstand temperatures because they're literally wearing these fur coats, and they have claws that the tools that they need to survive are part of their biology. But with us, we're these like walking, I mean, we don't, it's almost like we don't belong in these environments. And I wonder if that's a evolutionary kind of thing where that is, we're constantly trying to prove that we belong in this environment. And that,
well, we constantly put ourselves at risk in the environment and then fight to prove we belong.
but just by existing, we're at risk is what I'm saying, though. That's what I'm saying.
If risk means our body's going to die, it's a guarantee it's going to happen. So what's the risk?
Well, when you have, the risk is that you have all this investment in your life and your experiences and stuff. And then,
but you're going to lose that investment at some point.
Yeah. But
right?
That's why, and then this is another topic we've talked about, is the idea of,
to that point, Austin, there's no risk in that if you know you're going to lose it eventually. The freedom is in becoming aware that we can make any commitment we want, and it's going to go where it goes. We may have influence over it. We may be able to succeed by being diligent in our commitment to it, but we may also, by doing that, sacrifice the learning along the way by making believe the only thing we should be doing is the one narrow thing we've chosen. And I'm not suggesting that's the wrong thing to do. Survival depends on us succeeding. But isn't it interesting when you talk about the animal kingdom and how well suited they are, that the thing that seems to hold us in superior esteem, according to our own thinking, our ability to think about ourselves, is the exact same thing that condemns us to an idea that the universe is harsh and has us wondering why we act the way we do, that are depreciated compared to the appreciation we create by expressing the abundance we've been given. And there's 8 billion people on the planet or close to it, which signifies that for all the wrong we've done, we still seem to have survived. Yeah. Somehow we seem to have a guiding principle that's exceeded our capacity to be destructive. And yet we're still relying on nature. And it's still giving us we don't have anything yet from Mars except a couple of soil samples or the moon that have come here to give us more than we have, and we're still squandering and fighting over the limitations while we're using them excessively and putting ourselves at the threat we're claiming the universe and the earth is posing to us. The abundance has been here the whole time, and we haven't been able to abuse it yet to the point where we've gone extinct, but we're working on it. And I would say it's the same thing we do in our individual lives when we make believe that what isn't true is true, and we start living a life based on ideas that have no basis whatsoever, and we begin to think we are what we think and end up worshiping ego as a goal and thinking all we are is what we think and wondering why we feel alone and not noticing our complicit nature in causing that impression. It's interesting. The one thing that seems to be the superior thing in us can also give us the chance to actually kill ourselves and make believe it's the only, kill ourselves and each other, making believe it's the only thing we can do. I would say it's a misuse of our potential. Not to suggest it isn't usable, because it's clearly happening. But it is a misuse if it is actually undermining our instinctive nature to thrive and survive. And naturally, when it's time and our bodies have run their course, to disintegrate again. The body disintegrates. But what does it really do? Just returns to exactly what it was before we got it. All the elements that it's made of will still be in this universe in the exact form they were before we came into this human experience. So we really don't even go anywhere.
Yeah, but I think maybe I'll feel that way when I'm older. But as I like drink this iced coffee, it's like I might go back into the ground and become but I even though it might not be real and I still enjoy, it's delicious and certain things I get to experience that I'll certainly miss when they're gone. And it makes me panic. It honestly,
I doubt your body will miss anything when those things are gone, because it won't have any sensation to give you impressions and cause your thinking to consider it.
I know, but
here's the bigger point. You can do all of those things, and all of those things are given to us to appreciate. all of the options and the variety of things we have are given to us to appreciate them. And when we abuse our thinking, they turn into things that seem to condemn us when it's in fact the condemned thinking we're doing that causes us to use other things and attach to anything or anyone and everything and everyone as an excuse for what we're doing, rather than simply begin to concede it's generated by our own thoughts. Those ideas about what's wrong when they're wrong are indications we're clearly aware that something's wrong, and we're doing everything we can to try to overcome them and feel better, rather than concede something's wrong in what I'm doing, not in what I need to make up for it, not in what I feel condemned to. The thinking is condemned because it has no basis and it has no applicable purpose. So we're designed to be productive. And if all we're thinking about are things that are unproductive, we're going to live a life that appears scarce. But it isn't the scarcity of the universe or nature, it's the scarcity in our thinking that we're struggling with. So being young, I think the velocity of youth is great. Lots of energy, lots of vitality, lots of imagination, lots of ideas, lots of possibility. That's all possible. And there's no reason to thwart that. And this is not about thwarting it. It's about seeing how we undermine. My suspicion is we are not afraid to die. We are afraid to live. And the fullness of life has always been our nature. And for us to act in ways that subvert that and think that we are in charge as a result of doing what we can to undermine our potential is a pretty sick concept about living and expressing a full, thoughtful life. And addiction is that thing. And addiction doesn't begin and end with the most obvious compulsions. It is triggered by any thought we have that's wrong that we decide is right and start fighting for. Because once I chronically try to maintain that thing, I create stress that turns to trauma, and my body 24 hours a day is under an emergency condition that is eliciting drugs, chemicals in my body to deal with an emergency that isn't even going on except in my thinking. My body doesn't have a judgment. It lets my brain do the judging. But when my judging is bad, it goes into an emergency mode saying, we're in trouble. We gotta try to bail the water out of this ship because it's sinking.
Well, yeah. Well, usually like the best things in life, you can't really put into words. They're indescribable and they're more feelings, but the narrative that you have in your head that's causing the anxiety is usually a limited language. I mean, it's just me speaking English saying you're fucked, but it's totally it pales in comparison to this sort of nuanced, that was an Alan Watts quote, is like, we have this incredible device in our heads of language, but it's limited to the kind of all encompassing language of the universe. Well,
it really isn't in an essential term, because our body language is actually our senses. And when we take our senses and misinterpret those senses, it isn't the information. Our senses are giving us accurate information all the time. It's what
I'm talking about English, like the English language.
Oh, I understand.
Like
I understand.
That is the voice in my head that's causes all.
Yeah.
That's what I think is funny, is like, you would think that for something that I regard in such high esteem as my brain, that is, gives me my perception and reality, you would think that it would have a more nuanced and more wiser language to communicate these anxieties, but it's just English. It's just a limited American English.
We choose the language,
right?
Russell. We're choosing English as our only form of description, and we're denying the body language that isn't based in a human developed language. It's based in the raw experience of our sensations. And to think our sensations aren't what we're feeling is to start think of all the things we describe as feelings are always wrapped in words.
Or to deny that they're a language in itself too.
Yes, exactly. So when you're talking about English is something that was developed by humans. The body language was developed by our body for us.
Exactly. So, and it's like, no wonder we're so miserable and crazy, is because we're relying on this, or if you speak Spanish or Hungarian or whatever, we're relying on a created, language to tell you what's wrong with your body and the world around you, and not the That was something that a topic of those Carlos Castaneda books, where
Mhm.
the guy, the teachings of Don Juan, and the guy trying to find the recipe for the peyote drug mixture, and Don Juan would talk about the language of the world and listen whenever like a crow would fly by. That would be a response to his question and stuff. But um, and it's to bring back to the point of empty spaces and stuff like that we were talking about earlier, is and space and matter and dark matter, how there's things out there just because we can't see, but they are existing, and we're in a world where we basically, I don't believe that there is such that empty space is, I think empty space is an illusion, because if you really like try to look at it objectively, there's so much, even in an interaction between two people, there's much more going on than what you see. There's all these nuanced things that whenever you may perceive empty space in any instance, if you look a little deeper, there is stuff occupying that space. And so back, and even to kind of go into the conversation we were having about survival, and what I was trying to say about humans having this evolutionary anxiety because we're not meant to, we're so vulnerable in relation to our environment. um there's so much and more happening than we care to admit, and it's no wonder that, but we're so fucking crazy that we will blame one singular thing on it, whether it's like as to why things aren't happening the way we want them to. I don't know if that.
Well, one way of doing that is to use everyone else as an example for what we're not willing to admit we're doing. And so far we've been talking theoretically, which we have the absolute capacity to do, to think in theoretical terms and think about all those other things. But it's our thinking that we're doing that's causing those ideas to even be entertained between us. So in our experience, Austin, when we first met, I know that you had been sober for a little while and you kind of went away and came back where you realized that you thought you were going to manage the problem on your own for a while.
Well, I didn't relapse, just to clarify. When I went away, I just went away in,
Yeah.
yeah,
You,
but I
you went
was
away,
sober the whole time.
you went away, stayed sober, but thought you would manage it on your own. And when you came back, you were pretty depressed.
um well, it's just, and I think that there's a lot of debate around this, whether or not
Well,
drug.
let's talk at this point. Let's transition into actual rather than theoretical.
Yeah.
Your experience is actually your experience. And talking about that directly is probably something we don't all do that well.
Okay. Yeah. I'll
Because
get, yeah. Sorry.
no, it's just a shift of focus.
So
And
the reason I was so depressed was because I guess you could say drug addiction and alcoholism is a mental illness, but and to refer, I was told that it's a disease, but I think of diseases as something, you know, like something you can take a medicine for. So a mental disease is difficult for me. And that's why I was so depressed, because um, I quit drugs and alcohol and I thought my life was supposed to be fine. But
you know,
as I heard someone say, like when you get sober, the outsides get better, but the insides get worse. And so you would think logically that if you are a drug addict and an alcoholic and you quit drinking and doing drugs, that, you would be happier and whatever. But yeah, I was definitely sadder, because it's this sort of, what is this disease that I have? I quit drinking. Why am I miserable? It's kind of like it's like having an STD or something. It's something that never goes away.
you remember one of the first points we covered 4 years ago?
No, you have to remind me.
Well, the claim that when you get better on the outside, you get worse inside is really not accurate, but it's certainly a perception of thinking that when you actually start paying attention to what's worse, you start feeling worse.
Oh, yeah, I do remember when I told you about how well, yeah, I'm feeling worse, but that it's an indication of growth. And another thing I've been told is, um, so much of my drug use is numbness. I'm numbing, and we've talked about this before. Like, being numb does not mean that there's an absence of pain. Um, and
An indication of pain.
yeah, it's an indication of pain. And something. I mean, early in sobriety, I literally had to rewire my brain and realize that when I feel bad, it's actually good mental health. Like, because I'm recognizing, you know, if things didn't go well in a relationship or in my job, and it made me feel bad, I would just mean that that was the end of the world, and I would have to do something to make me feel better. And now I realize that when I feel bad, that's actually good mental health. Like, of course I should feel bad. If I didn't feel anything, that would probably be concerning. Um, so
Well, and to that point, feelings and responsiveness are typically signs of life. When someone is laying on the ground after an accident and the paramedics come, they're looking for signs of life. And responsiveness is one of those signs.
yeah,
Are they breathing? Are they doing anything that would indicate that they're alive? Are they able to respond? Are they conscious in their mind? Is there mental capacity there in their brain to be able to interact and note? They always ask, what day is it? Who's the president? Where are you? Questions like that, seeing what your orientation is and how far you may have been hurt in some traumatic state. So responsiveness is very different than reactiveness. And
yeah.
reactiveness is always a defense.
Distinguishing the difference between those two has been a big part of my growth in sobriety, and for the longest time. And why, when you said I was depressed when I came out, because I really didn't know the difference between responsiveness and reactiveness, and I thought reacting is responsiveness. That's the only that is. They were one and the same for me.
Yes, that's addiction. Addiction wants to make believe that real life is what it's doing when what it's creating is a false life that is based in ego and based in a concept of self, but not actual self that's united in an essence that we all share. It's divided in thinking we're all doing individually and thinking it's who we are. And no wonder people are reactive today and easily incited to reaction over the slightest. So many things seem to be so critical now and so explosive in terms of reactions. There's so much of that going on. And I feel it. I feel the anxiety and the potential buildup of those things. And I can notice by looking at those that I must be maintaining ideas that aren't true. And I must be creating defenses to protect those ideas because I think they're true and I think they're real and I'm relying on them. And if we've been doing that chronically, not thinking we're doing it, how good are we going to get at being responsive, where we take a moment and consider what's happening and actually take a breath in between the knee-jerk reaction before we react in ways that we'll regret and wish we hadn't?
That's why I think is an unfortunate theme in today's world. I don't know if it was for back in the day, but this idea of my truth and stuff, because so much of my growth has to have come from, like, the prayer of St. Francis, like, we die to live. We had to die to live an eternal life. But really what's
dying is something that never existed. And we're starting to give way to the idea that who we think we are is never who we've been. And it doesn't matter how long we maintain it. The nature of addiction is to try to give chronic reactiveness permanence, and by giving it permanence, make believe it's true and real. And it's constantly trying to reinforce itself by making believe that if we do it longer, someday we'll prove it's real and true. And all we prove is that we create misery and depression and anxiety and stress, and chronic stress is traumatic for a body to live through. So these points that we're sort of going over turning points in the sense of starting to see things more accurately and see the broad view that happens as a result of seeing them accurately, rather than the narrow perception that seems to be all we know and all we think and all we're doing.
Yeah.
Starts to kind of open it up and you realize, oh, okay, well, yeah, I can do that. It's not required of me, but I can certainly think that, and I can continue to think that, and I can fight everyone and everyone else, everyone and everything if I'd like.
Yeah.
I can do it.
Well,
And I do
especially
that daily
I
in
know.
some way or another. It doesn't, the potential doesn't go away, and we're not condemned by that potential to any other degree than we're maintaining thoughts that are contemptful, that we end up then grasping for other contemptful thoughts to justify that what we're doing is right.
Well, I think
Lies foster lies.
yeah. Well, I think when you see it as a function, as something that is something you can do, rather than something of like, rather than what you are, you gain to appreciate it for what it is, and it's just another function that we have. And instead of, because
well, you're describing choice now.
Yeah, because
and
it's not
the essence of addiction is that you have no choice. And what's ironic about that, if we say we have no choice, and choice always allows to choose whatever we want and or not choose, why are we using choice as the excuse that we don't have it? Because we end up using the same thing that proves we have it to justify we don't. That's the twisted nature of the thinking. So you're seeing, you see that, and you're starting to use those pieces in your language a lot differently than you did when we first met and talked about it. And you've started to see how that works.
Yeah, but I still have a long way to go, because I have a huge potential to make up my mind about things that
you always will.
Basis. Yeah.
You will always have that potential. The difference is, to the degree that you think it has you're still maintaining ideas that you haven't conceded that you're creating. That's all. That's all.
Yeah.
And so what we largely, and this is what you and I have been working on a little more recently, what we largely struggle with are the thoughts we think we're not having, which is why we so immediately figure out what's wrong in everybody else with such perfect clarity, while we're continuing to struggle in self-doubt and not put that together.
That's what I was talking about, that empty space, the thoughts we think we're not having. I mean, how many times have we all created a whole story on what's wrong with our lives, this, that, being depressed, that it turns out we're just dehydrated, and just little nuanced things that we don't take into consideration.
We're not breathing well.
Yeah,
our posture and stature is crippled by the depression and the anxiety and stress we create chronically. Literally impacts our ability to breathe. And breathing, being quintessential to our survival, ends up inhibiting the ability of our organs to function properly and our blood to flow properly, and all of the other functional capacities we have are undermined. All of our bodily systems are undermined by stress. It's a primary undermotivator for our body to function well.
Yeah. Usually on most days I turn into such a spaz. I'm sure, like, as my girlfriend will attest, I kind of convinced myself that there's more I could do about a situation. There's more I have to do. And
I guarantee it. You could mess it up much worse than it is.
Yeah. But that's the thing, is when I can kind of tell myself, no, you're doing all that you can do.
No, I mean, whatever's done is all you can do, but whatever you're able to do is everything. And the freedom comes in beginning to see that we're absolutely free to continue to act in addictive manners. Absolutely free. We have the absolute right and choice. It isn't something we shouldn't do. It's something we absolutely can do. And as that is embraced, the idea of doing it will make a lot less sense. Just like jumping into a volcano filled with hot lava doesn't tend to be something people do pretty quickly. They're pretty sure that if they do it, it's not going to end in a goal that they're really looking forward to.
Yeah. Now I understand. When I was a little kid and I would ask my teacher, can I go to the bathroom? And they would say, I don't know, can you? They weren't just correcting me on good grammar. They were offering me the choice that I could totally just pee my pants right in front of them, or I could go to the bathroom and
not ask.
None of that would prevent me from relieving myself. It doesn't, but as a kid, I thought I have to go to the bathroom, but I could go anywhere.
So in this, we just covered a few of those basic points that became evident to you very quickly. And I want to say this. It isn't because of the work we've done together. It's because you know those things and simply haven't interacted on that basis with someone else. It's not because of what I did. Because if what I did didn't have anything to do with you, what you know, it wouldn't have had any impact at all. It would have just been more information that was swimming around in your head that you thought you had to cobble together in some way to make sense out of because it made no sense. Mm-hmm. So if we're accurate in our communication, you and I, or you and everyone, and start to speak in terms that actually address what's happening, that's beneficial. But it isn't beneficial, again, I'm repeating this because this point is important. It isn't beneficial because I say it, and it's not beneficial because you say it. It's beneficial because we know it. We know what's right. And if we did not know what's right, we would not be so clear on what's wrong. And we seem to be a species that's very clear about what's wrong. We're pretty sure we know exactly what's wrong with the world while we're suffering in our own seeming lives separately. Seems to me there's a lack of clarity to be so sure of what's wrong rather than what's right between us. That the focus has been so dissected from looking at things accurately that what we tend to see clearly in each other is what's wrong more often than actually what's right.
Well, that's what we talked about yesterday is we're always maybe talking more about the solution because we're always trying to put a definition around the problem.
Well, because problems are defined by definition. Mm-hmm. They aren't problems until we mislabel them and misunderstand them. And things are what they are, regardless of what they are. It isn't a problem that stars explode in the universe. It isn't some catastrophic event. It's just what happens. It's always been that way. And if it's been that way and provided us what we have here, it doesn't seem so wrong as to give us the opportunity to even consider that thing. We're sitting here with the potential to consider it as a result of all those things that have ever happened that would seem catastrophic if they happened in the community next to us or in the community we lived, but aren't catastrophic at all because it's just doing what the universe does and we're a byproduct of that doing. We've been created or made or evolved, whatever it is that got us here. Maybe all of the above, maybe none of the above. Defining it in any way that is incorrect is unnecessary. To speak of it in general enough terms to let it be whatever it is and take our foot off the gas of trying to think we need to get there in further definition and academic studies and scientific proof. Whatever is happening right now is happening as it's happening, and it is proof of itself by simply doing what it's doing. Not what I think it's doing, not what I think it should be doing, not what I think I hope it does or wish it does, but simply what it's doing. Mm-hmm. And if that's a baseline for stability, when I remember that in the process of thinking and choosing, I remember that what I'm doing is what I'm doing and choosing to do in thought before I start mislabeling and acting in ways that seem to put me at contest and in debate with everything by simply saying, this is a choice I'm making. And it's going to have consequences. And I may not like the consequences because I probably have some buried ideas about what this is going to give me, or maybe obvious ideas about what it's going to give me. And if I don't get what I think it should, I can either fight it and make believe that I should be getting what I didn't, or look at what I did to end up getting what I got and see that I can adjust course and maybe get better at doing the thing I'm asking to have happen. But very different than feeling condemned and just constantly becoming corrupt because now I need to get what I want at all costs. And the cost is that everybody else pays for what I think is a benefit. And it's not a benefit to me either. Just another level of insanity trying to express itself in a claim that it's true. So your knowing nature, and I will again go back to this, is that when we had early discussions, and I think there were things you weren't quite grasping in your understanding, but you would say things that went well beyond what I was talking about, that gave me a clear indication that you were very much intact and fully able and fully functioning and starting to see through the cracks of that chronic resistance. Because those things would escape. I don't even know you always noticed it, but those things would escape. And I would say to you, that's absolute brilliance. You've admitted, you've spoken to. You saw it clearly. I think when I told you that, then your doubt would set in and you'd think because of all the other things you were thinking, that couldn't possibly be true, when in fact, intuition isn't something we can take credit for. It's just something we do naturally. And intuition is knowledge beyond reason. It means it takes no good reason to be knowledgeable. That's our nature. That expression is the one that we postpone, depreciate, defer, interfere with, and are chronically trying to pretend isn't there, because to acknowledge it would be to dispel all of the rumors we've told about our life for the whole time. And since all those rumors are filled with fear, it seems like facing fear would be impossible, when in fact the impossibility is continuing to face it day after day after day after day, thinking it's normal, thinking it's usual, thinking it's healthy, thinking it's the only thing I can do.
Yeah, we put so much stock into those stories that they've created meaning for us, and so if we take them away, we're telling ourselves that we're meaningless. When
But
which is a lot. Yeah,
you do that. Yeah.
yeah,
So if you see that and begin claiming that your experience of individuality is based on largely those stories, you have a body that seems separate, and yet it's intimately involved in all of the elements that are necessary to, like oxygen would be a good example. We don't tend to wake up in the morning and worry about whether there's going to be enough oxygen for the day.
Mhm.
And yet it's critical to our bodies, and we don't breathe deeply, typically.
Mhm.
Our stature and posture is so depreciated because we don't tend to sit up straight. We don't tend to walk well, because the stress of our body is pulling our tendons and muscles and everything in directions that are creating imbalances and problems and things that we don't even notice, and just think that they're something that's happening to us again.
Yeah, I mean, in early days, I called you with, I got to figure this out with my job or an apartment or all these things. And honestly, 100% of the time, I just needed to breathe and relax and get back to what my body is supposed to do to function.
Well, it's doing it. You're just helping it dysfunction by undermining it with stress when you're thinking about things that aren't happening. And what's interesting about beginning to just notice what's happening and pay attention to what's happening is that there don't tend to be any emergencies in what's actually happening when you just see it as what's happening, rather than what you think should be happening or shouldn't be happening, or wish wasn't happening, or wanted something else to be happening. And what's interesting about all those thoughts is that they're all based on the idea that what's happening is possible not to be happening. And if what's happening is always happening, it's impossible that it's not happening. And that slight gap is the difference between aligning thinking with the present nature of our existence, which we are always in. We're always present. We're just struggling with thinking we're not present, because the thinking we're doing isn't paying attention to what's happening. It's paying attention to what it thinks is happening. And that's why worry seems to be so chronic, because when it's paying attention to what isn't happening, I would be worried naturally, because I know better than to think worry is just a prayer for what I don't want. And the idea of doing more of it to create more of it is pretty insane. And yet it's exactly what addiction does, thinking it's the only thing we can do. And it's all based in thinking. It's all based in a misuse of thought. Thinking is not the problem. How we utilize our thoughts are the problem, or misutilize them.
It's just hard. It's just difficult to look at someone in the eyes that might be experiencing some really terrible event in their life and to tell them.
But that's just based on a thought you have about what's difficult.
Yeah.
It isn't difficult for them any more than you make it. When you make it difficult for them, now you're choosing their future by imposing your anxiety on their experience and insisting that's what's true and real. It's just another thought. It's just another thought. And we can tell those thoughts because they'll always lead to more and more thought. We'll all be off on these mental benders, nurturing that thought, manufacturing new thoughts about that thought, thinking more and more and more and more and more, trying to make it real, trying to support the contention, only because it isn't. And to admit that it isn't is simple, because it stops the whole train. It stops that whole tirade. It stops that whole obsessive process. That's the difference between resolving, which is attempting to feel better about what's wrong, and simply addressing what's wrong and getting better because it's allowed to dissipate and dissolve rather than be resolved. There takes no resolve in our effort to fix something that we simply recognize as broken, and bam, it goes there. Thoughts of this sort don't exist in the world, they exist in our brains, and then the world seems to be a difficult place to be because the world we seem to be living in our brain is difficult. Those are choices we make. Contemptful thoughts lead to a sense of condemnation. It is no more or less than that. And it's, if we each do it, looking at it individually is what we're doing rather than seeing it. So we can see it collectively, which is a good start point. But to see how sure we are about the wrong in others is a very interesting idea when we seem to have no real strength and confidence in what we're actually doing that's wrong about the thinking we're doing about everyone else we're so sure of.
So you talk a lot about, and I think the irony too is, I think you're just telling everybody what they already know, and then
Exactly.
what do you,
so the thing that doesn't seem to know it is thinking. So talking is about thinking.
Yeah. What do you ever, I mean, let's talk about experiences we've had where you feel like you're aligned with that absolute truth, I guess, or where what does your life look like, or what, even if it's a mundane experience, it doesn't have to be something super big or deep, but what is an example of living, I mean, a literal example, like an interaction with someone that you've had that you can report as being exemplary of this sort of truthful living, I guess, if you want to describe it that way?
Well, I would say it's daily recognizing any of the conflicts and doubt and worries I have are just, I just observe them as what I'm doing to cause them rather than as something happening to me. That's a very different shift for me.
But what do you still struggle with?
Everything that I choose not to believe is correct or accurate.
But no, like for those listening, like we were talking on a real intellectual basis and a theoretical basis, you know, let's in a human context, like what do you struggle with? And you don't have to get too personal, but
everything I think of that is incorrect that I think is correct, I still struggle with.
Yeah. Do you have specific
all kinds of thoughts? Well, yeah. I mean, I have all kinds of thoughts about how idiotic drivers are when I'm behind them. And I start seeing how quickly I turn the driver into all of the things that are basically my reaction to them. I mean, that's probably one of the more common areas that I seem to find objectionable, because it's so common when I'm driving to see things happen that are outside the expectations or hopes I have, right? So I've quickly labeled the drivers as being idiotic and stupid and can't drive and all that kind of stuff, when basically 95% of the time they're just doing what they need to do to get where they're going, and they're not thinking about me. So since my tendency tends to be thinking about what I'm thinking, I tend to think that anything that doesn't go the way I think it should tends to be an affront to me. So I can still see those things happen.
What about, I'm talking about high stakes stuff.
Like?
I don't know. Existential turmoil and angst, you know?
No, it's all the same thing in my experience, Austin. I'll go to any length to justify what I'm doing wrong, to claim that it's some highfalutin idea, when in fact the actual experience I have of what I know, I already know. And it's all complete and it's all whole. One of the big transitions in my experience was when I began to realize it doesn't matter what I think of something that's absolute to anything other than what I think. The absolute doesn't change. My nature doesn't change. My health doesn't change. My essence doesn't change. What changes is my physical form and the thoughts I have about that form and my interreactiveness with other people or my interrelations with other people. Those are the things that are impacted with it.
Yeah.
So I would say everything I find out there that's deficient is deficient in my own limited thoughts.
Yeah. And I don't know if you already spoke about this in the podcast previously, but I guess I'm a little curious, that moment in time in your life, what you talked about, that transition, when you transitioned, like what was going on in your life, and what, specific human examples, I guess, because we're here
I
now,
guess,
but
yeah, I don't tend to recall the stories as well as I used to.
yeah, isn't
I
that
think of it more as fundamental to what I'm doing. But I mean, one of the things that I think was interesting is that a guy who had struggled in sobriety and come and gone and come and gone and come and gone and come and gone, and eventually jumped off of the parking structure on Second Avenue in Santa Monica and killed himself,
Mm.
had randomly said to me, I read this book called Disappearance of the Universe, and it has to do with that was referred to him by this other woman we know. He was a trainer at Gold's, and it was about the Course in Miracles. So I went down, immediately had the inclination to take his direction. I went down to the bookstore and bought it and came home and read it. And it was all about forgiveness and all about the essence of what the Course in Miracles was. So then I read the Course in Miracles, and what the Course in Miracles made clear to me was that essence isn't debatable. It isn't diminished by my inability to express it. It isn't diminished by my inability to think about it. It isn't diminished by anything. So that any diminishment I'm doing is caused by what I'm doing, not what's happening to me, but what I'm actually creating. And that was interesting because I had a sneaking suspicion in sobriety that there was something unifying that we were not talking about by focusing so much on the symptom of drinking, not drinking all the time, not drinking no matter what, going to meetings, always doing this sort of ritualistic kind of behavior, when in fact, I sensed that there was something underlying this. The other thing that happened was I went to Herb Kay's 1-year workshop. And since it's 1 year, I went 3 years because I'm slow to learn. And what hit me in there, because he allows all people of all walks of life, of all compulsions, and people who don't have compulsions or don't think they have compulsions, to come in and share equally together in one environment. And I started listening in there, and I don't tend to follow directions very well, so I never did all of his homework the way he prescribed and all that. But I would take notes as I went because I was listening and experiencing. And what I started to see was that everybody in there was talking about the exact same thing with different stories associated to different attachments and different compulsions. And so it seemed to be different, but it was all the same. Why would it be the same if we didn't share something in common? So the stories attached to the compulsions just happen to be the things people chose to do. And my body doesn't tend to metabolize sugar very well. So alcohol, I tend to be allergic to alcohol, which is all sugar-based. So when I drink some, an allergy is an abnormal response. What's an abnormal response? A reaction. What's a reaction? Knee-jerk, quick, immediate. What do? The one thing I shouldn't do is the only thing I decide to do. So I drink more. How does that work in thought? I'm addicted to the ego. I'm addicted to the reactive thoughts I create, and they're reactive because I know they don't exist without my constant fueling them and thinking about them. So as I started seeing that more clearly, I also read that book, I Am That, and I forget the guy's name. It's too long for me to ever seem to remember, but he was a guru and a Maharaji in India who was visited by a British journalist who had come there to basically dispel the whole mythology of the Indian guru. And the Beatles had gone over there and had an incredible experience. And this very educated journalist went over and basically asked this Maharaji questions, and the guy basically dismantled his questions and kind of laughed at the whole approach and all that. And the questions were brilliant, and he was obviously brilliant, but he also engaged enough to start to actually look at what he was hearing from this guy in a question and answer thing. And it's a book that's it's been around for 40 or 50 years. But the other sense of it was always having a sense that there was something going on that exceeded my thinking, that something had to be happening that was greater than what I was thinking, because what I was thinking was always so diminished and my capacity would follow that same thing. So those things started to actually perk up and percolate. And early in sobriety, in my first few months, I thought I would be, as you described, I thought I would be better not drinking and using, and I stopped drinking and using, and I was certainly better. But what I got better at was seeing what was really wrong. And I realized that it was a mental thing that I'd had since I was 3 years old. I can remember being reactive and defiant and defensive when I was a very, very young kid, and doing exactly the opposite of what my mother would say or my father.
Well, yeah. Well, I want to share an experience that I had, and it kind of, hopefully, after you hear it, maybe it would invite you to share an experience of your own. But the experience that I had that solidified my journey to relinquishing those attachments to those ideas was a girl I was dating had, I don't want to break anonymity or anything like that, but I guess she had read through my my 4-step inventory and did not like what she found and left me. And my immediate reaction was to sort of, I was already generating the stories, about how I'm a victim, and and I was gonna just
I remember.
Yeah. And but what clicked in my head was to actually, instead of use it as buildup of this identity that, like, when bad things happen to me, I usually have the tendency to use them as this is who I am, and this is why I act the way I do. Like, this, I'm a victim, this bad thing happened to me, this is why I treat you the way I treat you. And that was kind of my MO for most of my life. And so where I felt like I broke the cycle was in this moment of, okay, I'm not going to do that. I actually reached out to someone that I was working with, and I shared that experience, and I said, well, where's your inventory? Like, hide your inventory, like make sure your wife doesn't find it, or, so that they didn't have to kind of go through the same shit that I just recently went to. But the point I'm trying to make is, what helped me break that cycle of attachment to the stories was thinking of others, like an active attempt to try to help someone else in a situation. And it ironically made me feel grateful for this thing that I normally would have condemned myself over. Like, I actually was really happy that this happened to me, because when I saw how it helped someone else. So I'm wondering if that is relevant to you and what we're talking about. And because then it sort of really opened a lot of doors that, in terms of giving me, like, this, reminding me that, I really can make a choice. There are so many choices I could make in a situation, rather than becoming I don't know, like, whatever story I'll make up in my head about it.
Well, I think what you're describing is, when we align our actions, which thought is a primary action for us, because no voluntary action we ever take starts without a thought. They're all choices. So when we align our actions, which means our thoughts, with what's actually going on, if our source is generous, because it's always there, and it's everything because there isn't anything else, and if it's always accessible and available, and we express it, we would be acting in alignment with that source. And what would that be but thoughtful and fulfilling and mindful, and all of the things that we seem to strive for, while maintaining the thing that's mindless and thoughtless in terms of our concepts. If I'm absolutely recognizing that I'm absolutely based, and begin to concede that to my thinking, my actions tend to be more productive and helpful. And what I've learned about help is that I used to think I was helping when I was doing things, but I was really helping myself to the idea that I was being a big help because I was doing something for somebody. And I was very often doing the thing for them that was helping them kill themselves.
Yeah.
It's like giving a drug addict, most parents who have a drug addict son do not give him cash. They learn quickly.
Yeah.
that whenever they do it, it puts the kid at risk and he's closer to a potential overdose and they're not helping. So they come to terms with that. But we do it in society consistently and make believe somehow then it will work because all these scattered people around here don't quite matter as much as we do. And I would say that's a fault. In terms of experience, you're talking about stories. I had helped a guy years ago, as you know, who was mentally struggling, I knew. But in our neighborhood, you tend to make the best out of situations because this neighborhood has been basically treated like a foster child whose parents want the check, but not the responsibility. And LA basically sees us as the abandoned community that we were originally when they annexed us many years back. And in my estimation, anyhow. So we don't have a lot of resources. So we end up with people living on the streets down here who are often dangerous and have had pretty difficult histories. And one of those guys, I thought I was helping and I'd fed and gave him a little room to breathe. And he was kind to me as long as I did those things for him. But then he tried to blow up one of the neighbor's cars. And I said to him, I can't help you if you're behaving that way. That's not the point of my help. But I realized what I was doing for him was contributing to that. I'd been helping him get the impression that he was in charge. So he had more latitude. And what does he do? He tries to blow somebody's car up. So he said to me, I know how to deal with guys like you. And I said, you may, but I'm going to stand my ground. And he came back about 6 days later and slit my throat and put a 9-inch knife in my back and stabbed me 3 times in the chest and almost killed me, but actually had no effect on me except a little bit of nerve damage. But the point of it was that the clarification of that experience, which was pretty profound, it was like going to war for a minute. Because it was so dramatic and so extreme and so beyond the confines of my limited expectations and thoughts that I had a real moment of clarity. And I thought, I haven't been helping this guy at all. So in terms of help, I began to realize that I was not being helpful by being kind and nice in terms that weren't honest. And that effectively that's what enabling is. And that's what we're doing with so many of the people that are right now struggling on our streets by giving them more and more latitude to get worse, rather than do what we can today to begin to actually speak to them in honest terms that might allow them to get better. So my experience and part of what developed this conversation was talking more honestly to the people I worked with, and then also talking more honestly on a more public level to begin to see how this typical idea we have about nice and kind, when it isn't honest, is actually fueling the problem because it isn't addressing it with accurate information. It's actually enabling it. And enabling is one of the core issues of addiction.
Yeah.
So there's, if you want a story, there's a story, and it happened, and how I think of it isn't particularly how it happened. It's just the sum total of my experience about it that I share. But it was profound. I mean, it was a real penetrating experience per se.
No pun intended.
But it clarified an enormous amount for me. And one of the things that I got, Austin, which I think is to the point earlier about you conceding that we know what we know, is that I seem to need to be pushed by dramatic events, by the limits of my thoughts before I begin to concede that I'm thinking limited thoughts. Because during that day, I had an experience that was quite profound and quite enlightening and quite reassuring in the midst of something that was both threatening and violent and bloody and a mess. And I asked myself, why do I need to go to such lengths? And my only answer is that I think my life depends on maintaining these thoughts because I think they're who I am. And I haven't quite gotten over all of them yet, or I would be speaking to a much larger audience in much more direct ways, because people would be hearing what I'm saying rather than being confused by what I'm saying. And so my voice isn't fully developed in that regard, but doing this with you and others, I suspect, gives us all a chance to start speaking about it in accurate terms rather than the inaccurate terms we've been using to try to feel better about what's worse.
Well, that's what we usually spend time trying. that's probably the crux of what we're talking about, is telling people who are usually pretty angry at us when we're talking about this. It's like, you don't have to go so far to get it. Like, you don't have to use as much energy as you have been or think you need to use to come to where you already are.
If it isn't a space time bound thing and dimensional by space and time, divided by space and time, it's always where we are. So there is no place to ever go. And what you're referring to is that there's no effort in this. This is that comment about there being no resolve necessary to get there, because we're already there. And the concession that we're there is the beginning of being able to express it in thought, because we're conceding it to our thought by simply admitting it in thought. And that admission in thought begins to allow thought to relax, and our bodies will relax. And our bodies, if they have been holding stress and creating ailments, will start to undo those ailments, because we're not continuing to perpetuate the stress that's continuing to maintain the ailment that was caused by the thinking we started.
Right. Well, that's what the point I'm trying to make about this idea of empty spaces, because it's something that is, I think, an illusion in nature that makes us feel separate when we're exactly where we're supposed to be. But before I lose this thought, I just wanted to say what you talked about, the enabling and lack of frankness, and how it's actually detrimental. That I had a similar experience with. That's what helped me finally get sober. Was I couldn't stay sober when I was told, oh, you got this, just keep coming back, or it's going to be okay. What finally helped me stay sober is, you're fucked.
Well, it wasn't you're fucked. You were just honest about your condition.
Yeah.
But when you're finally admitting it, it feels fucked, because you've been doing everything you can to feel unfucked by being fucked.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, your life had been spent trying to make believe that what was happening wasn't happening. So to actually admit it's happening seems pretty screwy and pretty bad, to finally concede that what's happening has been happening, while the whole time it was happening exactly as it was happening. And denial didn't protect you from it. Denial just gave you the false impression that you could buy time and convince yourself until it turned into truth, when in fact truth has always been true. And what you finally realized was the lying nature of your thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm rephrasing, but also doing what I can to put words to it, to show how that's a present possibility all the time, to do that thing, always. And that when I feel I shouldn't do anything but what I'm doing, I am in some way nurturing thoughts that aren't true. Mm-hmm. Because the fact is, freedom allows me to always do whatever I want in any way. And when I'm sick, the only thing I want to do is sick things that I will then not claim responsibility for the consequences of. And I will disavow ever having wanted them, because I can't stand to imagine it was me having created them, or my choices having created them. It isn't really me creating them. It's how I'm utilizing my human functional capacity, mm-hmm. or depreciating that functional capacity. So if we are operating on a chronic basis of a depreciated functional capacity, it's no wonder so much is going wrong in our world that we're watching and witnessing and feeling as though it's impossible to resolve. Because that feeling would come from my own sense of impossibility for thinking I have anything to do with it. And if I don't have anything to do with it, then nobody else has anything to do with it. And it's just happening because we are just a sick bunch of people, born in sickness, determined to die in sickness, and determined to do everything we can not to live. And I would say that's a little contrary to most people's hopes and expectations.
Yeah. I mean, I always wondered why it was so difficult to understand that. But I mean, I've been saying that since I was born, since as early as I could speak. I'd be like, I didn't ask to be born. I was just thrown into this.
Who knows?
Yeah.
There may have been a choice there too.
Right.
I mean, we have all sorts of frames of reference we use to paint pretty pictures to support the contentions we have. And if they're wrong, all we're doing is helping ourselves to an idea that we're the creator of right and reality. And that's a conflict, right? So what I've learned is just whatever it is, it is. And when I have ideas, they're ideas. When I have thoughts about things, they're conclusions I've made. It doesn't mean they're right. It doesn't mean they're real. It doesn't mean they're conclusive. It means they have limits. And anything that's limited, obviously, either is the limits are the beginning of everything else, or they seem to be the end of all things. And it's interesting that the same thing can have those two extremes, but everything within a relative field of experience has opposites. Good is opposite is bad. Nothing is everything.
Yeah. I'm trying to push you a little bit. We always talk about what we think, but we rarely ever talk about what we know. Because you said like thinking is just a function. Thinking is not knowing. It's just a function. It's just something that we're able to do. It's a tool, but and it's not knowing. And I know you're probably running out of time, but I want to talk more about what are things we know. And we
everything. Everything.
Yeah.
If we're in the midst of everything and everything is everything, there is nothing that we can't know.
No, in terms of
it would mean that we don't have a contact with something. Something that's absolute can't be divided. It can't come in pieces. We can think it can, but there again, thinking is interceding on behalf of creating its own reality. If we know what we know everything there is to know. Now, does that mean we know everything who knows? I mean, whether we do or not, whatever we know is obviously much greater than what we think we know. And starting to think in those terms is very much what we're talking about, because what we're talking about in thought is defective, not because we're based in defection or defective nature, but because we're based in an absolute nature. And what is defective becomes defective in concept very easily because we know it's wrong very easily. Mm-hmm. And we live with a sense of what's wrong most of the time, I would suggest. And people don't have to think that to be experiencing it. And if they don't think they're experiencing that and watch their reactions, they might see that they do react to things in proportion way beyond the circumstance when they get triggered. So there must be some sense of what's right in them that isn't right and is wrong.
I guess, I mean, what do we know in the context of this like play that we're in, of life and interaction, social stuff? Because it feels all very subjective.
It is, because you're a subject making decisions about it. Mm-hmm. You have a body with a brain, and that's the one thing you get to control is the on-off switch of your choices. So it doesn't mean it becomes those things. It just means that's what you think about them. And effectively, all we're talking about here is the absolute, but we're talking about our experience within the absolute, and it isn't even within it. It's with it. We're a product of it we don't have to come to the conclusion of that absolute for it to be what it is. So we're a product of it. Our thinking is a product of it. Yeah. And if we begin to align our thinking, we will know what we know because we'll start expressing it without thinking about it. It'll just happen intuitively. We'll say and do. You've done it. I've witnessed you do that, which was my point earlier to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I mean, how have you you being in business and how have you navigated partnerships and business and getting? I'm sure you've had partnerships with people in which you've relied on the feeling you get from them, your intuition. How do you navigate those interactions with people, maybe in business or just in life in general, with this idea of we know it all, we know what we know, true.
Principles underlie everything and everyone. And if I'm acting principled, I'm seeing them as who they really are rather than what they tend to do. But it also gives me clarity in knowing there are probably some people I should be suspect of and to not trust what they're saying. But I can then be better at defining my limits and my commitments within that business relationship without forcing them in any direction and see how they go and what they do. And that was, being principled is easy because it doesn't take I don't have to think about what's right or wrong. And if I'm thinking about what's right or wrong, I guarantee you it's not principled.
I know that, I mean, talk about reactiveness versus responsiveness. I've had so many reactive relationships and they never last, because you're not letting people be who they are. You're not forgiving them. You're not letting them.
Well, you're just thinking you're not. And again, you're back in thinking is conclusive, because you think that's who they are, that's who they are, and that you've done something to them. What you've done is just fed the grid with more anxiety, so everyone else gets to reinterpret their own reactiveness in some new story to make it look different.
Right. Yeah.
So,
you have a better way of explaining it than I do.
Part of the discussion, Austin, is to get better for both of us. I don't think I do this well. I know that I do it better than I've ever done it, because it's been gnawing at me since I was very young. And I've always felt uncomfortable and uneasy in social situations, which I don't seem to have anymore, because I've gotten more honest about things and more direct about things. And I see the tendency that I always suffered from was one I was creating, not because of everybody else. It was just a self-imposed seeming exile.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm great at this, but I can pretty much attest that I've gotten better at it simply by doing it. And that's what I would hope we do and allow our audience to do, by just hearing it and starting to say, wow, if I'm actually thinking in ways that are corrupt, why wouldn't I act in ways that are corruption, that would express corruption in any way, even if it's subtle? It doesn't have to be, the highest levels of government to be corrupt. It can be as close as our own recognition that we're corrupting the thoughts we're having about other people and having a corrupt relationship, or seem like it anyhow in that way. So because my time is coming to an end today, and I think we committed to an hour and a half, which we are just over. Let's save some of this for number 2, because you and I are going to have 3 of these conversations if you're willing. We'll do one next week, I expect, and then one after that. And what you've hit on, in my estimation, is service. And what does service really mean? And what does the 12-step really mean about carrying the message and practicing principles? And that isn't often talked about in terms that I suspect are tangible enough to begin to realize how to apply in everyday circumstances. We know not to lie in the most overt ways. We know not to be dishonest in the most overt ways. But learning to be honest about our experience, whether it's right or wrong, is a very different approach than thinking we can only be honest about what we think is right and only promote what we think is right, and then live wondering why we're constantly fighting to look right rather than actually feel right about what we're doing. And if I have a wrong thought and I'm willing to admit it's wrong and just say it, or say it without knowing whether it's right or wrong, simply to get it out, I have a very different relationship to that than the experience I create when I'm constantly trying to promote the ideas that I'm always right.
Yeah. Well, I just want to push the idea that we think of service as something that is like it's as a responsibility, but I truly believe service, not for the sake of responsibility, but service because that's part of our nature as human beings, is to be of service.
Well, consider that if the infinite is infinite, it's always giving us everything it has, and it always has, and it can't stop, and it's never pulled back, and it doesn't give and take. It doesn't do all the things humans do, and yet it continues to give it to us no matter what we do. And that's that's really the definition of love. The Bible talks about it. Shakespeare talks about it. It's written about through history. Love's not conditional. It doesn't take itself away from us when we're not good.
Yeah.
All those contemptful ideas we have about God are absolute ideas about ego and what we create, and the contemptful relationship we have to this thing we call ourself. So we're going to get into that a little deeper next time. And I appreciate you being here. I appreciate the challenges you pose in my own conversation, because I'm not always, I think, as clear as I can be, and I want to get better at doing that. So I appreciate your insight and your probing. I remember the first time we did this together in a studio years ago when I was just beginning to conceive of this, and you basically our discussion was you interviewing me. Right. You immediately became an interviewer, which was interesting because I'd never been interviewed. And it really gave me a chance to sort of explore my own thinking in relation to your questions. And so it was very helpful. And I still appreciate that aspect of your both experience and your willingness to challenge and stand up to what I'm up to. And I don't often get that because I tend to be the biggest voice and the biggest talker and the most active verbal nuisance in everyone's life. So I appreciate it though, because the interactive component here is really what allows us, as you're talking about service, it's really what allows us the perspective to start to see what we're doing in common, even when it's dysfunctional, and start to be easier about admitting it publicly rather than make believe we have to go alone and isolate and do something to give us the impression that isolation is the only thing we can do and wonder why we feel alone.
Mm-hmm.
So I love you. You're a good man, and I've really always appreciated you greatly. And I know that we had a little gap recently, and I'm happy to see you back and talking and being with you. It really gives me great value to know you, and always has. And I know wherever you are, you're where you are, doing what you're doing, and I appreciate your resolve and committing to sobriety and looking at it and challenging your own precepts and presumptions and predispositions and looking at them, having the freedom to look at them with me is a really valuable experience for me. Very much.
Yeah,
And
I feel this. I feel the
I would
same
hope
way.
everyone else too. Thank you, Austin. I love you,
Thanks,
man.
Jack.